You're listening to TFM.
Want to join in the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode? Join the Babel Conference, our listeners' discussion group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field, and we'll look forward to seeing you there.
Hey everyone, I'm Rod Roddenberry, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Are you taking all these books? I thought I'd take some light reading. Guess I got bored.
Well, hello and welcome to TFM's Books and Comic Show Literary Treks, and I'm just one of the hosts here, Matthew Rushing. And with me, as he is every single time, is the one and only, the lovely bearded Casey Pettitt. I love the beard, Casey. It's looking really good.
It's nice and thick now. It's coming in nice. Although that means it's time to trim. I noticed you're more clean shaven than the last time I saw you.
Yeah, I did the whole no shave November, and so then I just felt like it was time to like kind of start over. And I don't know, it was like I'm going back to Dallas for Christmas. Nobody needs to know this, but anyway. And I was like, well, I'll look nice for people there, so whatever. But we are so excited because we've got 2 more shows for you this year. We've got this episode, and then we are going to be talking to David Mack about his latest book that, as we're recording, just dropped today, Harm's Way. So if you haven't picked it up, you'll want to pick it up because we're going to be interviewing him soon, and that'll be coming out even before the end of the year. So jam-packed into the year here, but if you would like to help us out, you know what? Go over to patreon.com/TrekFM, become a patron just like Casey Pettitt or Greg Rosier, who are helping support the network here through Patreon. We really appreciate their support. And we've got some special things coming up there. I know through the 602 Club, we're going to be doing some bonuses, and maybe we'll get some of that stuff going as well for literary treks. You just never know. But you'll only be able to get that type of content through Patreon. Plus, it keeps all the episodes coming to you each and every week that you get here through TFM. You can also find us on social media at TrekFM on Twitter or at TrekFM on Instagram. Of course, we're on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. If you would like to talk to listeners from all over the world in our listeners-only discussion group, you can type Babel into the search field on Facebook and find the Babel Conference, and then you would be able to, again, join listeners from all over the world talking about our different episodes and everything going on. You can also find us online at trek.fm, and you can find all the shows we're doing. And last but not least, you can even send us an email over there at the contact section. So, Casey, before we talk about Enterprise, the first adventure, we do have some comics, which I'm super excited about this. We've got Lower Decks 3 and Star Trek 2. Not that Star Trek 2. One. The other Star Trek 2, because I'm pretty sure there have been number 2s in Star Trek comics before. So anyway, Lower Decks 3, we actually end up wrapping up this trilogy here. And how did you feel like it ended up wrapping up this story? And did you feel like this was as strong an entry as the previous entries that we've gotten so far?
Yeah, I'd say, it's another strong entry. I would say it's maybe not my favorite, but it does wrap up the story nicely. I feel like the authors and the artists and everybody kind of found their groove by the end of it. It just continues the story from the previous one. You get little tastes of the, upper decks, the command crew and their mission, but it really still focuses on the lower decks, which is what we're all here to see. And, it really doesn't disappoint. It continues the story nicely and wraps it up nicely and, leaves some potential breadcrumbs for the future.
Yeah, I think the best way that I could put this is that it ends in the most Lower Decks fashion possible. And I think that just continues everything that we've said beforehand. And so, like you mentioned, whether or not this was my favorite issue of this 3-part arc here is neither here nor there. I think what this does is it just continues to feel exactly like the show does, which is really important in this. One of the things I did want to ask you, because I was thinking about this as I was reading this issue, and it just made me wonder. I think that this does as good a job as possible of making it feel like Lower Decks. And at the same time, I was thinking to myself, would I have rather just these, again, been episodes that we had gotten in a season rather than this? And of course, maybe we would never get these stories besides that. So, but I kept thinking to myself, I just feel like this is as close as you can get to Lower Decks, but I almost still wish that they had been episodes.
Totally. The way that this is written, I think we've said it since issue 1, like it felt like watching an episode, and this would have actually been kind of a fun continuing arc to have this Dracula holodeck character, kind of like Moriarty or, any of the other sentient holograms, I guess, that we know. It'd be fun to see him pop up throughout the show. And, yeah, I don't know what else to say. It's just, I think that's a testament to how well they did these comics. And it really just kind of leaves me wanting more. It leaves me wanting more of the show, but I'll take more of the comic books instead, if that's what we're going to get for now.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it, in that, a lot of this does feel so much like the show, and I think it's one of those things where it's the highest compliment that I can pay them, the fact that, these comics, what you want is for it to feel like whatever Star Trek they're trying to tell. And which is, obviously the most important thing as well when, you're doing any type of expanded medium for Star Trek or Star Wars or any of these franchises. You want it to feel that way. And I think, in all honesty, my question is really the biggest compliment I could give the comic, which is, God, this was so good. It could have just been, episodes that we had gotten. And so the fact that I'm even thinking that, I think speaks to the quality that we got here, in the sense of mirroring and mimicking and being just like what we watch on our screens during a season of the show.
Yeah, it's not so ridiculous that you just write it off, but it's just ridiculous enough to be Lower Decks, and wanting to see that. And these comics are so full of the same kind of Star Trek in jokes and tropes that we love about Lower Decks, and looking for all these Easter eggs. And even at the end of the comics, they'll point out a few of them. Like in this one, they mention different historical characters, I think, that have been on the holodeck. And I don't know. You could go through this just like the show, like with a fine-tooth comb, and look for all of the little Easter eggs. Like I think Reg Barkley, if I remember, I think it's in the Nth Degree, where he hooks himself up in the holodeck with the same kind of thing that Dracula does here. I mean, it's just, and it flows so well. So yeah, I think I hope they continue doing more of these. I hope it's not just this little trilogy that we got here. They've done well enough. The proof of concept is there. Let's get more of these.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with you. And so I think all in all, to me, this entire arc is something that I would recommend. These first 3 issues would definitely be worth picking up. And I think this one is so incumbent on the first 2 because you have to have read them to really get what's going on in the story. But I'd just rate the whole thing overall a good 4.5 out of 5, maybe even 5 stars, just because It feels so much like what we get with Lower Decks.
Yep, I'd be right there with you. 4.5, 5. There's not a lot wrong that I can find with these ones.
Yeah, which is great. Which leads us into we're back with Star Trek II, our kind of Avengers-style comic here with Captain Sisko and his crew on the Theseus, and they are traveling to Kronos after the destruction of the crystalline entities. And goodness, Casey, does this whole issue just kind of opens up some things. One, there's some big revelations about what's going on in the Klingon Empire. But then there's this whole group of godlike beings we've never heard of that live within the boundaries of the Klingon Empire that are actually kind of the impetus for this story in ways we didn't know until this issue. And so I'm being somewhat, not trying to give it all away because there's some great stuff in here, but oh my gosh, I'm loving this. It's so far. I mean, this is just great. This feels like almost like comic book Star Trek storytelling, like when I think of like big comic book character art type things. Yeah,
I think I like your analogy to the Avengers. I mean, that really is what this is like. And I feel like every issue we're going to get more and more of the characters, that we get Worf in this one since we're going to Kronos. And even a slightly different Kahless than we're used to seeing on, Deep Space Nine. Or no, is that on? Well, I guess he was on Deep Space Nine and Next Gen or whenever it was he came back. Anyway, like it's just, it's jam packed full of stuff. And I liked even that it kind of called back to the Klingon one shot that we got not too far back with the kind of trifoil bridge over the canyons where the battle happened, and they referenced that battle that we saw in that comic. So that was actually a lot of fun too, seeing them tie these together. We see Tom Paris. We see like the way they even add some kind of there's a little bit of background on the Klingons at one point. It's just kind of they call it a memory alpha diplomatic briefing, and it just kind of describes the Klingon Empire. So if like you're new to Star Trek or you're new to the comics, you just need a little refresher, it gives that to you in just a real quick page to tell you kind of who some of these characters are that we're seeing or that we're referencing. And with kind of a reboot, that's kind of what we're doing. We're trying to reintroduce people to Star Trek, and so getting these little vignettes of information, I think, is really nice and helpful for the comic book reader that maybe isn't as familiar with some of this stuff.
Yeah, and I mean, your mention of Kahless there, I was thinking how interesting it is, and much like Deep Space Nine is where you take something and you just kind of move it forward. And, the Kahless we get here is somebody who has kind of found his place and his power in the Klingon Empire and has been flexing it. And again, I think it's much in the same way that Deep Space Nine would use things that TNG had set up and then move them forward. And so, to me, I think this comic is just doing such a great job in that. And I really am. I'm blown away by how much I'm enjoying the comic and just how interesting I'm finding the storytelling in the first place. It seems like almost a combination between Deep Space Nine and the storytelling we're getting in like Picard. That kind of feels like it's like if they had a baby, you'd have this this series. And it's one of the things I'm actually looking forward to the most when it comes to Star Trek, to trying to figure out where this is going, because to me, this is 2 issues in and I'm really hooked by what we're going to do.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, especially when we're using so many of the characters that we love, and comic books are even less beholden, I feel like, to canon sometimes than even the novels are. But I do wonder, since this is kind of in that period between the end of Deep Space Nine and the beginning of Star Trek Picard. There's a lot of years there. And so I kind of wonder at some point, are they going to kind of light it up a little bit? Especially because we don't know what we're going to see on season 3 of Picard. And so, I doubt Worf would reference in that show his exploits here in these comics and what will probably eventually lead to the Defiant series of comics. But, yeah, I'm fascinated to see where they go with this. I like that they've already got the spinoff planned with Worf on the Defiant, and just looking to see where this little universe of Star Trek goes.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I honestly can't wait to see where this goes. And so, well, as we wrap that up, Casey, I'm so excited that we're heading off into our very first adventure. So we're going on an adventure. So, Casey, this is, I would say, a sprawling book. There's a lot to this story. And
that's a good way to put it.
In that, yeah, the only way I could think to really break it down is to kind of talk in like character arcs. But before that, kind of setting everything up with what this first mission of the Enterprise is, which the beginning of the book is Kirk recovering from his experience on his very first ship, the Linda Sutherland, which had been a part of a battle. His first officer, Gary Mitchell, has been badly injured. And because of his actions there, he's being handed the Enterprise from Pike, who is being promoted to Commodore. And it seems to, I think the interesting thing about the first mission that they get is that Kirk is obviously expecting to be able to boldly go. And instead of being a mission to boldly go, they're being given a mission to boldly babysit a group of vaudeville performers and basically going on a Bob Hope USO tours. Yes. Through star bases on the edge of the neutral zone with the Klingon Empire. And so it's absolutely not the mission that Kirk had in mind.
I don't think it's the mission that we had in mind getting into the book. Had you read this before?
I've never read this before, so everything in this was a surprise to me. Yeah. Especially the mission that they choose to go on.
It was an odd choice, to be sure, I guess. The Admiral at the beginning was adamant that this was such an important, USO tour for them to go on. I mean, it was almost kind of a proving ground for Kirk, but he kind of already felt like he had done that. And not to get too far ahead, but I just don't feel like the ending of the story paid off as much for the Admiral's insistence that this was such an important mission. Since, as we get into talking about it, we'll find out they never actually ever made it to the first starbase they were headed to. Like they end up on a different adventure. So, it was an interesting way to start the book. And especially given the Admiral was like a family friend, you'd think he would have maybe shown some favoritism and given Kirk kind of a better deal. I'm kind of glad, though, that they didn't just dive right into some kind of 5-year mission or anything like that. It was, because we have a long way to go, or at least some way to go between this mission and Where No Man Has Gone Before. So,
right.
It was an interesting choice.
What's most interesting about the book, and you were kind of almost, I feel like dancing around it, so I'm just going to go ahead and say how I feel about this in the sense that the first mission that they're given by the Admiral here, and I don't necessarily know how that mission was to help Kirk and his crew, but the mission they accidentally end up,
Yes.
100% kind of goes with what the Admiral, I think, wanted to have happen, but I don't understand how that would have happened just being on, this USO tour.
Yeah.
And so it accidentally works out in the Admiral's favor in, I think, gelling this crew the way that he wants that to be able to happen, and for Kirk to be, to be able to get his feet wet again. But yeah, it seems like a strange first mission to send Kirk and the Enterprise on in the first place, especially when the Admiral has no idea that what is going to happen is actually going to happen. So, yeah, it's a little weird.
Yeah.
One of the things that these books can do is a great job of giving us an understanding of the characters in a way that we haven't before. And of course, here, this is seeing Kirk at a time we've never seen him, which is right as he's getting promoted to the Enterprise. And, he's the hero of this battle. He's been in recovery, though, because he was severely injured. During that time, he's met Carol Marcus, and they've fallen in love because she's actually one of the people who had helped create the biomimetic gel, basically, that they use to help repair his injuries. And they've already realized their relationship probably isn't going anywhere because she's not going to ask Kirk to stay, and he can't really ask her to go. And so, yeah, there's a lot that they do with the character of Kirk in this book, which I think is really interesting, and I feel like in a lot of ways, any of the minor, I guess, issues with his character storyline, I can chalk up to the fact that this is a really super young Kirk, and so he's not fully formed yet. So I was interested in in what McIntyre is doing with the character here and trying to kind of set that foundation where you can, peek through the cracks and be able to see the Kirk who will be.
Yeah, and what's interesting is the book came out in 1986, so it's, I guess it would have come out right around the same time as Star Trek 4. And so by the time this book was written, there was a lot of history of Kirk. There was a lot of history of all of the characters. We'd been through at least 3, maybe 4 movies by the time this book came out. And so it was really interesting to kind of, with that in mind, read about this much younger character, seeing him, with a much younger Carol Marcus, seeing what they were like towards the end of their relationship, that they really were in love, and, his friendship with Gary Mitchell, which really, I thought it was actually kind of a shame that we didn't get much of that. I know there's like another trilogy of books that I think that they're both in together, but I almost would have liked to see Gary Mitchell there just to see how they interacted.
Mm-hmm.
But I suppose it also did the story service by not having him there, since we never really got hardly any screen time with Gary Mitchell. It was really the other characters that we wanted to see how he kind of met and got along with, and Bones is really the only one I think that we find out that he actually knew before coming to the Enterprise. So that was actually kind of an interesting dynamic, and kind of nice to see that he wasn't going into this like total group of strangers. He at least had one person on his crew at this point that he knew. But seeing his command style, especially compared to Captain Pike, which all of the current crew are comparing him to, because that's their most recent captain, and he's so different, and he gets called out on it a lot by the crew, by the visitors, kind of by everybody, on kind of how brash and naive he's being. And it's really interesting to kind of, even just through this one story, watch him grow in his command style, but also gain the trust of his crew, his new crew.
You know, it's really interesting you say that, because I think one of the parts of what we see here with Kirk and the way in which we kind of see him grow is that I think he starts off with a chip on his shoulder. And the chip is the fact that he feels like he's got the cojones to be able to do this job. And yet, he also isn't necessarily trusting himself completely yet in the way that he will in the future. The other part of that is he's also been through a big trauma, and he's working through that trauma. And I think that's leading him to be harder on himself and everybody else around him, because he's basically, and I would say he's overcompensating for his own feelings. And to me, that's actually really interesting. And I think that's something that gets worked throughout the book, like you were talking about, which is really interesting. And a part of him dealing with this new command, and I think you're 100% right in the fact that it doesn't help that, you know, all of these people have absolutely been with somebody who is a very distinguished and reputable captain like Pike, who had really established himself, obviously had been captain for quite a long time. Many of them have worked with him for years. And this new kid on the block comes in. He's literally the new kid on the block. And he's only 29.
Yeah.
He's the youngest person to be given the command of a starship of this magnitude. And so that leads to all sorts of things that kind of go wrong, in the sense that he has clashes with a lot of people. Uhura, Spock, and specifically Scotty too.
Yeah.
Who, you know, they don't trade blows, but they trade verbal blows, and he basically tells Scotty, hey, you just need to transfer to somewhere else. And they work it out, of course, by the end of the book. But I think one of the things that McIntyre does very well here is that she doesn't make it easy for them to all come together. Like you said, McCoy is the only one who's his friend. You know, it feels very much like, in that sense, you can actually see where they pulled for the Kelvin verse.
Yes.
They pulled from this story, I think. And part of that is that Kirk is this brash young guy that nobody looks at as being anything other than that. But McCoy knows who he is, and McCoy knows what he's capable of. McCoy believes in him, trusts him, and they work well together. And so he's basically the only friend he has on this ship until the end of the book, where a lot of the crew has been able to come together. And, you know, you see Kirk, Spock, and McCoy kind of form that triumvirate by the end of the book. But you also see characters like Scotty and Uhura, you know, become comfortable with him. And so, yeah, I think the only thing that doesn't really sit right with me is the way in which Kirk, you know, he just had this relationship with Carol Marcus, so it seemed very early for him to have, like, any kind of feelings for anybody else. And that kind of annoyed me a little bit in the book. But, you know, I mean, otherwise, that was a pretty minor annoyance.
Yeah, they kind of but they kind of dove into his promiscuity a little bit. I mean,
alleged promiscuity.
Alleged, yes.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, the way he talks in the book, it's like he's actually falling in love with Lindy, and then gets jealous when she goes somewhere else. And it's like, you just met her. And I mean, I feel like that's just...
Not only did you just meet her, but you just got out of a relationship with somebody that you were in love with. At least you said you were in love with. So, bro, come on.
And that we know they were close enough where they're gonna, unbeknownst to him, have a kid together. So, yeah, there's that part I didn't care as much for. I felt like that was a little bit forced, but I did like his, because you said he kind of comes in with a chip on his shoulder, and it really did feel like, he was almost overcompensating for his just youth, and it's pointed out to him so many times at how young he is, and he gets to the point where he's like, I'm really tired of hearing how young I am. I know how young I am. And in trying to prove that he's earned his spot as captain, he's being very decisive, but it's so different from what the other crew, or what the rest of the crew had with Captain Pike, that, Scotty is the prime example of someone who's just going to call him out every single time.
Right.
And on the one hand, you can kind of understand where Scotty's coming from, because this is a very quick change for everybody. But being in a quasi-military organization like this, you'd think change of command happens quite a bit, and this wouldn't be the first time that they're serving under a new captain. So in some ways, I kept wanting to tell Scotty, you know what, lay off. Just, I was kind of getting frustrated with Kirk. Like, can you please just obey one order without question? And in the end, Kirk is essentially kind of proved right in some of his orders, like telling Scotty, don't fire your weapons, don't fight. If you have to, retreat. And, Scotty followed that order, and everything turned out well. So, it was just, it was kind of frustrating how Scotty acted with him. And I liked a lot more the relationship with Kirk and Spock and how that was starting, because it was less contentious. It was more that Kirk didn't like Spock, mostly because he didn't choose Spock. He wanted Gary Mitchell to be his number one, his first officer, but the Admiral selected Spock for that position. And so it wasn't really anything personal, I think, that Kirk, had issues with Spock. It was really just that he wanted his friend there. And by the end of the book, I really like that realization that Kirk has, that the Admiral kind of had told him about, or somebody else had told him about, was Gary Mitchell and Kirk are too similar to be the top two officers on a ship. And he needs somebody like Spock that can, be the id to his ego, or, or the super ego to his ego.
Yeah.
So, that I feel like the thread of that relationship through this book, I think, was very well done.
Mm-hmm. No, I definitely agree with you. I think, with Spock as a character, I think the interesting thing about him is we're seeing Spock in that time period, from the cage, and between that and what we get and Where No Man Has Gone before. And there's this Spock that is still being formed, right? He's still very raw, and his ultra literal nature is coming out in the extreme in this type of book. And I think that that's what really makes sense, actually, for the character here. And, there are some things I think that are a little bit interesting, right? In the sense that it feels a little bit strange or new or whatever, but to me it just all made sense, because this is a Spock who really is the way Spock changes from the first pilot of the cage, and then the way they portray him again in the second is different. And so I think they did a great job with Spock here. And this is also a time period, like you mentioned, when this book is written, it's still very early in what we know about Spock, and who he is. I mean, we've had the original series, and 4 movies at that point. And, you know, what we think of as the character Spock, I think, is still to be even more informed by books to come, honestly. And you know, all the way through, you know, Star Trek 6 and then beyond when he's on the TNG. And so there's still so much more of this character, and even Vulcans themselves. And so I think she actually does a pretty decent job here with Spock, and his again, he's just so literal. Like, he's like literal Larry. Everything he just takes literally. And like with Spock, you could literally say literally all the time, because that's how he takes it all, right? But I think that's something to which, you know, he even struggles with, and you're talking about a little bit about that relationship with Kirk, because, you know, Kirk goes on intuition. It's that informed intuition that we see Kirk go with all the time, right? It's like he's pulling all the pieces together in his head, and then he has a gut feeling about something to do, which not everybody else can completely see, because it's not always all logical, right? And Spock's struggling with that, and so do a lot of people on this ship, because I think we get from the book is that Pike was much more logical and kind of literal himself in a lot of ways. And so, yeah, I thought she did a pretty good job with Spock. You know, I always have to take into account exactly what you said when this type of book is coming out and what we knew about Spock then. And to me, when you're writing this early, again, it covers a multitude of things that might seem somewhat incongruous later on, just because this is the formation of these characters.
Yeah, it's really interesting because, yeah, with as much as the author knew when she was writing this, that she had to actually go back and like unwind a lot of the knowledge that the reader would have had at the time in order to place this story when it was placed. And so, you know, the first time we see Kirk and Spock together, they're playing 3-dimensional chess in Where No Man Has Gone Before, and they're kind of acting like friends, like they would serve together for a while. You know, but in the book, Kirk doesn't know anything about Spock. And in fact, he doesn't know much about Vulcans at all. Like, he doesn't know what a mind meld is. He doesn't, you know, they're kind of learning a little bit about the neck pinch. And yeah, I really enjoyed the part where Kirk encounters Spock playing 3-dimensional chess by himself against himself. And Kirk essentially challenges him, you know, to a full game together. And so we kind of get to see, or at least hear about, their first game of 3-dimensional chess together, which was really fun. And I think was one of the ways that Kirk was able to kind of bond with Spock, to kind of say, like, I'm not just some illogical human. I have, you know, and I think it also kind of goes back to that chip on his shoulder a little bit. Like, I've got something to prove, but it was almost a way for Kirk to extend kind of an olive branch early on to Spock to say, we've got some similar interests. You can trust me. I know what I'm doing. I'm strategic. And you can trust me. And I think that was one of the things that 3-dimensional chess game kind of showed the characters for each other.
Well, I think it does a great job of showing Spock that Kirk has his own type of intellect. It's different than Spock's, right? But he is an intellectual. He is thinking about things. He has strategy. You know, there is a rhyme and reason to his quote unquote crazy that everybody else thinks they're seeing, you know? And so I think that's really important. And, you know, the other part about this too is that we immediately kind of fall in with Kirk and McCoy bickering back and forth, which, you know, if there's anything in this book that just kind of feels right on target right away, is those two falling into what's going to become a very classic pattern. And, of course, them being the different voices that Kirk is listening to. Mm-hmm. And so that's something that I thought felt really natural in the book to have happen, and to me really worked well. So, you know, again, I really liked that. Now, a character I had no idea that we're going to find out anything about in this book, and yet they spent quite a lot of time building into was Janice Rand. And much of her story felt like it could come straight out of Star Trek Picard.
Yeah.
And the universe that we see there, because she comes from this kind of backwater planet where her and her siblings had to escape from, their slavery. I mean, again, this just sounds like straight up Star Trek Picard, things that we had kind of seen there. And, she's been mistreated. She's actually lied about her age to get into Starfleet. She's actually only 16. And so, even though because of time dilation travel, she's actually quote unquote older, even though she's really not. So yeah, there's relativity in that. And McIntyre actually spends quite a bit of time building into who this character is to even give her an arc from going to be this like ultra shy, somebody who feels like she has absolutely no power even over herself, to being somebody empowered to become the character that we'll see later on in the series.
Yeah, this was one of those pleasant surprises in this book. When we first see Rand, it's like, okay, there's another character that we know, but the amount of time that we get with her and learning about her, especially with her conversations with Uhura, I don't know. She's not a character that we really got. We got hardly anything of her on the show, and so to see her here as a very young officer, she's brand new. She's just been promoted to Kirk's yeoman. Kirk has never even had a yeoman before, so he doesn't even know that dynamic.
Right.
And they get off kind of on the wrong foot together, partly because she's so shy, but she's got like no confidence in herself, and Kirk is just tired and grouchy, when she shows up, and he doesn't mean to, and he apologizes to her and everything, but I like getting some backstory for her, especially like you said with the kind of all the relativity stuff, because they had to travel at almost the speed of light. So like over the course of 3 objective years, it was only a few subjective hours for her. So, her escape from, what she had grown up in is to go into Starfleet, which I think was actually kind of, I guess it's kind of analogous to, people who join the military who feel like that's their only option and kind of a safe place to go. And so it's cool to see that she found Starfleet, and by the end of the book, she's going to admit about her age, and, we'll see on the show that she's still there, so we know that she's not getting kicked out or anything, but just to see, because she can be pretty tough on the show, and so we kind of get to see a little bit of how that's born here in this book, which I just really enjoyed her storyline overall. Well,
and what I do think it does is that it shows how much formation is still to happen in the Federation. There's a lot they're still kind of on a monetary system here, and, the Federation still has a long way to go. And that's another thing that I think, you could read this book and be frustrated, but I think it actually does a great job in just kind of like Enterprise, giving you some of the unexpected so that you have somewhere to go. And I think, with Rand and her story, that's really interesting. Now, the other side of Rand's story is there's a character that, it's kind of a little turd to her, Roswind, and I felt like there was way too much time spent on her at all. Once we were done with that part of the story, I was ready to be done, and they kept kind of returning to her. And if I had been an editor here on this book, I would have cut it out because it's unnecessary and I just don't care. And it doesn't go anywhere, right? It doesn't resolve in any way that made it make sense that I spent any more time with that character than her immediate connection with the character of Rand. And so that's definitely, I would say, one of my biggest criticisms of the book is there are other places where some of that kind of stuff happens, and it just... this book could have used some editing.
Yeah, it was definitely clunky in parts, especially when it was changing from scene to scene or whose point of view we were reading from. But the Roswind story was the most egregious because every time it came up, I mean, I'm talking like every time it came up, I had to stop and think, who is this person? And like, have we heard? Oh yeah, that's right. It's her former roommate. Okay. And it was just such a long con with this whole extra or new roommate that's just this green slime that's, sits in the sonic shower with, and the payoff. In hindsight, I feel like I should have seen it coming, but it just was spread out so long over the book that, by the time it happened, I was like, oh, okay. And on to the next scene.
Yep. No, I completely agree with you. With Rand, I think it was really nice to be able to get more of Uhura here, and especially the fact that, she served under Captain Pike. She comes in, a little bit more seasoned in that way. And we also see the fact that, she is a linguist. And, so part of this story is her becoming enamored with this language, which she realizes she's actually never going to be able to totally understand. And the way that impacts her, which I thought was great because, so much of Star Trek kind of forgets that that's Uhura's job is to be a linguist. And I thought they actually did a really good job. So, I really, appreciate that. And I thought it was really nice for the character. And again, it built more into, who that character is and even just why, she would kind of feel a little bit contentious towards Kirk at the beginning as well. So,
yeah, I don't think I could add much to that. I'm glad she was there, and I'm glad she was given as much as she was because she can often be overlooked. Hey, I'm glad we barely spent time with Chekhov, and that was just fine. And I would have been upset if we'd have gotten a lot of time with Chekhov and very little with Uhura, because she does add a lot to the story here and her character and her singing and everything.
Is Chekhov even supposed to be there at this point?
Well, I mean, you could say that, like, because he was filling in for Sulu, I think, from time to time on the bridge. And so that's why we saw so little of him, because I think he spent most of his time on the lower decks. So that's how I think of it anyway.
Well, this we mentioned that there's a big twist in the story in the sense that we don't actually do what the mission was. We get sidetracked by this massive world ship appearing on the edge of Federation and Klingon space and introducing us to an alien species that is one of the most unique and interesting in the sense that they are completely alien to us. And part of that is that they are an alien species who have lived for an extended period of time. And they are so old compared to our civilization that we appear basically like children to them, and their technology basically feels like magic compared to ours. And I thought that this was a good part of the story because, again, just by them being so strange by our reckoning, I mean, those are the type of things that you can do in a book that are so much more difficult in like a show. Mm-hmm. So I thought this was a great way to really challenge the crew of the Enterprise and, of course, Kirk with this really difficult situation where a wrong move could start a war between the Klingon Empire and the Federation.
Yeah, I totally agree. This was such a great way to... This was really the perfect way for Kirk to prove himself as a captain, but also for the crew to come together and to learn so much about each other. And, you know, like these aliens would have been so interesting to see on screen. I think it's something we could probably see more today on today's Star Trek shows, but yeah, to be able to use the medium of a novel to really kind of flesh out these aliens. And I felt like they were very well described, their not so much history, but their culture as far as their singing and having to learn the language. And then, just the way they interact with each other. They've evolved past needing names for each other. And, to find out that they're so long lived and they've been around so long. And we've seen that in Star Trek before, like with aliens that have evolved. And they're like, we'll come to you. We'll come back and meet you again in a few more millennia when you guys have grown up a little bit. And that's how these ones felt, especially towards the end when the crew has become so close to the aliens that they know that there's so much that they could learn from them. And I think they've realized that they've learned a lot about each other just by being around them. And I think that the interactions that they'd had with these aliens really was well written and kind of laid out, as far as they didn't just immediately start speaking standard. Like the aliens had to learn that somehow, and that was through a mind meld. And we kind of now learn how Spock is prone to kind of going out on his own. And, this is exactly what he does in Star Trek, the motion picture. Spock just goes out to mind meld with V'ger. That's exactly what he did here. And seeing those little glimpses of how the characters kind of will act in the future, but like kind of them getting to see, I don't know, how each other works, I guess, throughout all this. It was just a really great way to have everyone come together.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree with you more. I think it was a very good part of the story, and it really ended up being a benefit, especially in allowing this crew to be able to find a way to come together and become more of the crew that we expect. And so I love that. And, of course, what would be a TOS story here without the Klingons? And what was really interesting, too, is just how different the Klingons here are, and yet again, I like to think of it as the fact that, we're meeting a very early Klingon empire, that feels more akin to kind of the less put together empire that we even, in Enterprise, the Klingon Empire felt kind of like the proto-Klingon Empire. It felt like there were more factions, and here it also felt like that as well. And so, again, not really much bothered me in the things that people might look at as being different. I just thought this was interesting.
Yeah.
And it wasn't my favorite part of the story, but I found it to at least be interesting.
Yeah, it definitely wasn't my favorite part of the story either, but I mean, they needed some tension there to, I don't know, kind of an impetus for this world ship and these aliens to find another place to go. The Klingons did feel very different, but yeah, and the way I kind of thought about it is, similar to you. This is just kind of one faction, of the Klingons. They have a director. They talk about the Empress, which who knows who that is, like they're not talking about chancellors or anything like that. So, these Klingons could have been anybody. And, it was kind of weird how their story ended, but like at the same time, yeah, I didn't have a ton of problems with it, except that it just kind of took away from the First Contact mission.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's a great way to put it. And, kind of fun that they ended up having to give Kirk a medal.
Yeah.
Which, that's always enjoyable. One of the last big parts of the story is the Vaudeville company, led by this character named Lindy. And also, we meet Spock's cousin, Steven, who is another emotional-seeking Vulcan, a lot like Cybok.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what did you think of the idea of the fact that there was a vaudeville company in the first place at this time period? And did any of the characters really grab your attention or work for you?
I like how you put it at the beginning when you talked about kind of the Bob Hope USO tour. Like, that's really what this felt like. And I feel like it's kind of, when you put it that way, it doesn't feel so out of place. You know, we know it's not something we've ever seen on Star Trek before, but kind of at the end of the day, there's got to be like entertainers that are touring around. So why not a kind of an old-fashioned vaudeville company? It's almost like having a traveling circus or something like that. I mean, the fact that they'd put it on, such a big starship to ferry them around between star bases is a little strange, but it was a little weird for this story, and I don't care to read more about vaudeville companies in Star Trek stories anymore, but but
you're not hoping for another one?
No, I mean, I don't know if there's a sequel to this or not, but I may not be.
Enterprise, the second adventure.
Second adventure, yes. It's a spin-off, the Warp Speed Vaudeville Company. So like it didn't seem out of place for me, except for just out of place in the story. As far as any of the characters, there were quite a few characters in this company, and they were actually, most of them were actually fleshed out pretty well. I kind of hated Mr. Cockspur. I didn't care for the guy with the dogs either, and I can't remember why now, but Lindy was really the best character out of all of them, because she was kind of the leader of this troop. And she actually kind of seemed like the reluctant leader, actually, because her dad was the one that kind of started this, or, was the previous manager. But she was actually the one I wanted to know more about, because she's, the magician, the illusionist. But I feel like there was still something left open. Like, she might have actually been some kind of actual magician, not just an illusionist, the way that she would pluck an apple out of thin air or whatever. Like, or the coins that she was pulling out of Spock's ears or anything like that. Like, those were really fun scenes, but it also kind of left it open. Like, is that really just sleight of hand, or are you actually some kind of alien that can conjure these things up? So it was kind of fun to play around with that character. And then, Steven, Spock's cousin, we need more, it's just another never mentioned person in Spock's family that, and interestingly though, this was pre-Cybok, this is before, or this book came out before Star Trek V. So that's kind of interesting that she kind of had, I guess, kind of some foresight to think about Vulcans who might want to experience emotions, and why not have one related to Spock? Yeah.
No, I agree with everything you said. I think it was 100% a target. The vaudeville thing just seemed a little bit strange. The only thing I could think to myself of, where this it might make sense is the idea, Vix becomes a big deal on Deep Space Nine, and it's because it kind of has this old-fashioned pull to it, this sentimentality that might drag you towards that. But this felt a little bit different because it felt like a stretch that this would be something. There's a difference between being able to experience something like a holodeck program like that and this, where it is the basest of entertainment. When it comes to people juggling and doing magic tricks and those kind of things, that having actual Pegasus style horses, which that was way too far, and yet it was kind of an interesting place where, again, I almost feel like there is this Deep Space Nine Picard style look at the other side of life outside of Starfleet, which was interesting. And so I can't really fault McIntyre for choosing to use a vaudeville company, but I do think it's one that doesn't really work on the levels that she wants it to most of the time, which is somewhat frustrating. So, I'm really interested to hear, though, where you're going to kind of come down with your ratings for this.
I had a really hard time rating this one, actually, because there's a lot of good in this book, and then there's a lot of clunkiness and, things that just maybe don't tie together very well. So I came down at a 3 out of 5 and maybe even kind of pushing just slightly lower than that, but not quite so low that I'd go 2 or 2.5. So it just, I'm glad I've finally read it. I think that, there's, like you mentioned with the Kelvin universe, and that there's been stuff that's been pulled from this book before, and I think she did a really good job, but there's just a lot of it that, between the vaudeville company, but like I just said, the kind of clunkiness of the transitions and everything kind of made it a little tougher read for me. So how about you? Where'd you end up with this one?
I'm actually right there with you with the 3 out of 5, because I think there's more good than bad here, but I think a lot of the stuff comes from some just weird editing choices with the book that don't always work, and I think some story choices that I just don't love or just not always as interested in, but there is a lot that's good about this book, especially one that was written so long ago, and so the fact that, I can still enjoy it now, I think means that there's enough here for people to check out if they've never read it.
Are you not entertained? That's kind of what I wanted to say throughout the book.
I don't know. I was entertained.
Yeah.
And so I think that's what you kind of want from a Star Trek book. But, with this, I can't believe that we've come to almost the close of another year of literary treks. It's just phenomenal, and really excited where we're going to go with our last episode and what's coming up next year.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got my my copy of David Mack's new book here, Harm's Way, ready to dive into that so we can talk to him about it. I've only read the first couple Vanguard books. So I'm actually kind of interested to see how well I understand this without doing that, or without knowing all that. And knowing David Mack, I think I'll be just fine.
Yes, I'm right there with you. I can't wait to be able to do that. And I've only read the final Vanguard book because that was our very first interview with Dayton Ward back in the day when the show first started. And I've just never gotten around to reading the series. So I will be fascinated to see how this works. But my guess is knowing David and knowing the fact that a lot of new people might be picking up this type of book, everything you need to know would be explained. So I'm very excited to dive into it. He always writes a good yarn. But Casey, if people want to catch up with you, where would they find you outside of Literary Treks?
You can find me on social media. My name is @KnittingTrekkie. I'm on Goodreads, Letterboxd, Twitter, and Instagram. And you can also find me over on another podcast called Mickey's Marvels, where we talk about everything under the Disney umbrella.
And of course, you can find me all over social media under the name MattRushing02. When I'm not doing Literary Treks, of course, with the 602 Club, we've got all of the fandoms we love that are outside of Star Trek here on the network. And then, of course, you can find me doing The Orb, Warp 5, Saddle Up, and Artificial Tango. And then last but not least, you'll find me over in the Nerd Party Network with a couple of shows. One is called Owl Post, and that is a Harry Potter podcast I did with Drea Kaufman. Talked about every single chapter of the Harry Potter series. And then John Mills and I talk about Star Wars over on Aggressive Negotiations. But thank you so much for joining us. And until next time, live long
and read on.
You call that light reading? To each his own, number one.